If you saw it sitting there, you probably wouldn't stop to pick it up. A small dark rock about the size of a potato, resting on Antarctic blue ice, with no markings or glowing lights to separate it from the thousands of other meteorites recovered from that same shelf over the years. A field team found it in 1984, logged it as ALH 84001, and packed it into a container for a lab where it sat on a shelf for nearly a decade while nobody gave it a second thought. The question this rock eventually raised wasn't written on its surface. The scientist had to cut it open, dissolve pieces in acid, and stare through electron microscopes for years before they could even frame it clearly. Once they did, the question became impossible to ignore. At what point does a pattern inside a piece of stone become a signature that something was once alive? Before this thing was a scientific mystery, it was simply a piece of Martian crust. This isn't just a guess, because inside the Allen Hills rock, scientists discovered tiny pockets of trapped gas that acted like a time capsule from an ancient atmosphere. When they compared that gas to data from the 1976 Viking landers, which had sampled the Martian air directly, the isotopic ratios and specific mix of argon, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide closely matched the known Martian atmospheric signature. No other source in the solar system produced that same combination, strongly supporting a Martian origin. By working backward from that discovery, researchers mapped out a physical journey that's almost too big to wrap your head around. About 4.1 billion years ago, the rock cooled from molten material deep underground during a time when Mars likely had liquid water and a hospitable climate. Then, roughly 16 million years ago, a massive impact blasted debris straight into space. ALH 84001 drifted through the inner solar system before finally crossing paths with Earth, crashing into the Antarctic ice about 13,000 years ago, long before any human was around to see it fall. Antarctica was the only reason we have it. The moving ice sheets push rocks toward the edges of the continent, where mountains block the flow and meteorites pile up in concentrated fields. The cold, dry air prevents chemical weathering, and the absence of soil means almost no contamination from earthly life. Scientists have pulled tens of thousands of meteorites from that ice for exactly those reasons. And the Allen Hills rock was just one more specimen sitting in a Houston freezer with 4 billion years of history hidden inside. Nobody was looking for life. That context changes everything. The team that first examined the Allen Hills rock wasn't hunting for signs of life. Their original goal was Martian mineralogy. But what they published in the journal Science in August 1996 was a collection of 4 separate findings. Each piece of data seemed minor on its own, but the team argued that stacked together, they pointed toward a conclusion that made the scientific community deeply uncomfortable. First, the carbonate globules, tiny rounded mineral deposits with orange rims, chemically distinct from everything around them. Carbonates only found when water is present, so their location inside the rock suggested liquid water once flowed through those cracks and left these minerals behind. Water is necessary for every form of biochemistry we know. But water is not life. That distinction is quiet at first, but never goes away. Second, the PAHs, polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbon, organic carbon-based molecules found concentrated in the exact same zones as those carbonates. On Earth, PAHs can be associated with biological decay, which is why the team flagged them. But these molecules also form through basic chemistry in deep space without any help from living things, and they were present in the Antarctic ice surrounding the rock. Nobody could quantify how much of the signal came from Mars and how much had migrated from the Earth over 13,000 years. Organic doesn't mean alive. That problem quietly haunted every step of the investigation. Third, the magnetite crystals. Inside those carbonates, the team found chains of magnetite that looked strikingly similar to structures produced by magnetotactic bacteria here on Earth. Bacteria that grow magnetite inside their bodies to navigate magnetic fields. The resemblance was genuinely striking. But resemblance is not proof. Nobody could rule out whether a purely mineral process under the right temperature and pressure conditions could produce the same pattern. That gap in the evidence would become critical later. Fourth, and the one that broke the 1996 equivalent of the internet, the shapes on the surface. Under an electron microscope, the team saw tiny curved, segmented structures, cylindrical, divided, haunting. They looked exactly like microscopic organisms, only 100 nanometers long. That image landed on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. People understood the implications before reading a single word of the paper. The team cautiously called them possible microfossils. But a structure 100 nanometers long is roughly 10 to 100 times smaller than any known bacteria, and physically too small to contain a cell membrane, a DNA strand, or the protein machinery that separates biology from chemistry. The emotional power of that image and the scientific fragility of the claim existed at the exact same moment. The researchers never argued that any single piece proved life on Mars. They presented it as possible evidence. 4 things converging in the same rock during a period when Mars had water, worth serious investigation. The claim was careful. What happened next was not. NASA held a press conference on August 7, 1996. President Clinton stood at a podium and used careful words. Possible, ancient, needs to be confirmed. The official language was cautious. The public story was not. By the time independent scientists could put together a formal response, the story had already gone global, running on every front page and every nightly broadcast, because the public imagination doesn't wait for peer review. Carl Sagan, who had spent decades arguing for the possibility of extraterrestrial life, issued public statements urging caution while simultaneously calling the finding a potential turning point in human history. The media reported the second half of that sentence. A year later, the film Contact, based on Sagan's own novel, cut real footage of Clinton's press conference directly into its plot, using the announcement as though it was confirmation of alien contact. That's how completely the story had escaped the lab. A gap opening between what the data actually showed and what the public believed, and that gap was never really closed. The pushback wasn't a single dramatic event. Independent teams looked at each piece of evidence one by one, and over the next few years, the pressure started to crack the original argument. The PAHs fell first. New astrochemistry research confirmed that these organic molecules form readily through non-biological chemistry in space, and similar organic signals turned up in other Antarctic meteorites that had no connection to Mars at all. The contamination concern the original team had acknowledged turned out to be far more serious than they'd hoped. The signal that had looked biological was almost certainly terrestrial, migrated into the rock over 13,000 years in the ice. The magnetite chains came next. Lab tests show that heating carbonate materials to high temperatures produces magnetite crystals nearly identical to the bacterial variety. The structure the team had tested as a biological fingerprint could be replicated through heat and mineral chemistry alone. No life required. The size problem with the fossil-like shapes didn't get easier. Closer analysis of the minimum physical requirements for a self-replicating system confirmed the structures were too small by an order of magnitude to house a cell membrane, DNA, or functional proteins. Some researchers concluded the shapes weren't real structures at all, just artifacts produced by the imaging process. Then in 2022, NASA Astrobiology published findings that addressed the organic material directly. The organics in ALH 84001, the study concluded, were not formed biologically. They were produced by geochemical water-rock interactions, specifically serpentinization and carbonation. chemical processes that require no biology whatsoever, just water, rock, and heat. The geological window the 1996 team had pointed to as evidence of life was actually evidence of something far simpler. The 1996 paper was never formally retracted, and some of the original researchers continued publishing into the early 2000s. The claim never reached broad scientific consensus. What it did do was force every scientist who followed to ask a harder question. What would actually count as proof? What 1996 actually produced wasn't a discovery, it was a rehearsal. ALH 84001 forced scientists to separate three things the public still tends to treat as the same: a suggestive pattern, a possible biosignature, and proof of life. These are not the same thing. And before this rock, the field didn't have sharp enough tools to tell them apart. After it, the entire framework for evaluating biosignatures tightened. Instead of building a case from chemistry that merely resembles biology, the standard shifted toward requiring signals with no plausible non-biological explanation, and then checking that explanation exhaustively before saying anything in public. Every mission sent toward Mars since then, every subsurface water search, every organic trace analysis on distant moons, operates inside a framework built on what went wrong here. The rock didn't prove that Mars had life. What it taught us is how hard the next candidate will have to work before we can say that it does. Subscribe if you want to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads.